Hello everyone. Today we will be going over socio-emotional development in early childhood. And to start off with, we talk about Erikson's stages. And according to Erikson, kiddos in early childhood are understanding that they are their own person and they're really discovering what kind of person they are. And so children use their perceptual, motor, cognitive, and language skills to make this happen. At this stage, children begin to hear their inner voice, which provides a sense of self-observation known as their conscience. So their initiatives or actions may bring rewards or punishments, and they are continually learning through this process. If they continuously have widespread disappointment in various domains, then this leads to an unleashing of guilt that lowers their self-esteem. This makes sense if we're imagining ourselves in their place, trying out new things like exerting our own independence, and if we're met with negative feedback or discipline constantly, then our sense of independence, even autonomy, is stagnant and it just stays where it's at and doesn't grow. So alternatively, when leaving this stage, kiddos have the sense of initiative rather than guilt, which is dependent upon parental responses to their children's self-initiated activities. So given that information, how do we develop a sense of self? First, we want to define self. So the self is a conceptual system made up of one's thoughts and attributes about oneself. It includes the following components. So our physical being, which is our appearance, possessions, social characteristics like our relationships, our personality, social role, and internal characteristics such as thoughts, psychological functioning, and even spirituality. A sense of self is uniquely human, almost. So chimps and some of the other great apes have some of the first few stages of that development. So most of us don't think of having a sense of self or even having this self-awareness as anything special, but it actually requires sophisticated cognition. So our sense of self develops slowly over time and mirrors our cognitive development and can be seen throughout our development across the lifespan. So for example, between 2 and 4 months, we are gaining a sense of control over objects. Around 8 months, we experience separation distress. And around our first birthday, we start to understand the concept that others are different from ourselves. So infants this age engage in joint attention, so they will visually follow pointing and will point themselves. And so you can start to see where they're starting to differentiate between themselves and other people. They also show things to adults, so they'll give them objects and attempt to engage others in their activities. In early childhood, the concept of self becomes increasingly complex. So 3 to 4-year-olds describe themselves in terms of concrete, observable characteristics. So they tend to describe themselves in terms of physical characteristics, physical attributes, and social relationships. And so if you think about any 3 to 4-year-old that you may have experience with, this is like right on with their type of behavior. So, for example, if you met a kiddo who is, say, 3, they may say, "My name is Sarah, I have blue eyes, I run fast, and I have 2 brothers named Ben and John." So children also describe their preferences like, "I love my dog Molly," as a part of their self-concept. And they also talk about possessions, so "I have a red bike." Their self-concept is, when we characterize it, is unrealistically positive. They claim mastery, but actually lack that ability. For example, reading. They do not compare their performance to other people yet, and they do not consider their own prior success or failure when talking about their own or thinking about their own self-concept. So by the time children get to elementary school, they're refining their sense of self, and this increases throughout the elementary school years. So they begin to make social comparisons to their peers, and popularity and so on become increasingly important for them. And during this period, talking to children about their emotions is actually helpful to their socio-emotional development. So through these conversations, they actually gain a better understanding not only of their own emotions, but of emotional states of others. and this is important building blocks for empathy. So there are some observed differences between how much parents talk about their feelings with their children. So one explanation for this is in terms of sex differences between parents and how much they talk with their children about emotions, and this really points to socialization of our culture and the acceptance or even the normalization for women to talk about their feelings. So that's why we start to see sex differences, or one particular reason. And one question that may be posed and is actually talked about in the chapter is what happens when one or even both primary caregivers are experiencing some type of psychopathology like depression. So you can start to imagine the implications for a child's socioemotional development, but even the impact of the parent's depression on their availability for their child, their parenting, how that impacts their parenting practices like discipline strategies, and even their warmth or responsiveness to the child. All of that goes down. And so we also see within this period preschoolers, they gain more control of their emotions, although interacting with their peers is often difficult. Same age peers, when you're thinking about it, are just now learning to regulate their own emotions as well. So frustration is particularly hard to regulate in young children's peer groups, interestingly enough. So what we also see is that language can also help children deal with their emotions and regulate it, particularly fear. So if they can talk to parents and caregivers about what makes them afraid, it opens a discussion for why and if it's valid or not. So is it really worth worrying about? So if children are better able to regulate their emotions, then what comes next? There are times that it's good to disguise your emotional state, and as social editors and how we disguise or display our emotions, children must learn to hide their emotions in some context. So if children, when we're talking about children disguising their emotions, we are talking about emotional display rules. And so children actually learn to lie early at around age 3. In one experiment, 3-year-olds were left in a room with an attractive toy that was forbidden and told not to look at it or even touch it. Children showed signs of anguish when the video was played back in slow motion, but were able to actually fool uninformed observers. They could actually not tell the children who had peeked from the children who did not. So as children enter and progress through grade school, they are better able to conceal their true emotions, although they don't get really skilled at it until about young adulthood. So interestingly, girls tend to develop this skill at a more rapid rate than boys, and they may retain this advantage throughout the lifespan. So you may ask, well, are girls better liars? No, not necessarily true. It depends on the emotion in question. So girls are better able to suppress disappointment than boys are, and this may be due to social desirability or the desire to please others, as in the example of receiving a gift that you didn't particularly care for, but you're still being thankful and you still want to show that you appreciate the gift. So boys are not as able to disguise their emotions, particularly disappointment, or as motivated to do so. So also what we see is that boys have a more difficult time suppressing anger at peer taunting as opposed to girls. So we switch gears and talk about moral development and why do we have morals at all. And what we see is that cooperation and competition are necessary components of being human and for primates and a social species for that matter. So cooperation is a type of social behavior, pro-social behavior. And both cooperation and aggression are two ends of a continuum of behavior and are present from the early toddler years onward. So some children spend more time at one end of the continuum as opposed to the other. This may be due to their temperament, the sex of the child, and the experience and their own experiences. So going back to learning models and understanding how they learn to express that emotion or learn that that is an adaptive emotion to have. So all cultures have the task of communicating basic ethical standards and shaping or reinforcing good behaviors. We all have a system of rules about the value of those certain behaviors that we want to see in an individual. So specific values and behaviors emphasize that are important to that culture vary from culture to culture. So, for example, within the Thai culture, there's a value of respect for elders that is not modifiable, and so anyone who can teach you is automatically worthy of respect. They also value selflessness, where the more you have to give of yourself, the better you are as a human being and your value as a person. Adults expect children to internalize these rules or these rule systems, and thus expect them to feel bad or guilty when they violate these rules, and to also feel good when they abide by these rules. At first, parents have to directly control their children's behavior, but as they mature, children start to internalize these rules. This is why it's important to shape and teach children rules, set boundaries, and teach them from right from wrong based on the family's culture or their understanding of these rules. Otherwise, you start to see children with a decreased sense of empathy towards others, increased aggression, and rules that are not obviously internalized. These children will only abide by rules when an authority figure is present and the threat of punishment is possible. And in terms of pathology, this may look like conduct disorder, and that this then has a high chance of turning into antisocial personality disorder if not treated early. So if we're really looking at this from a Piaget type of perspective, children show little concern for rules up through preschool. At about 5 through 10 years of age, they show a great respect for rules, but apply them inflexibly. So rules come from parents, there's no change through time, and they're never to be questioned. So my mommy says so, and that's the way it is. So they have this type of rigid thinking, and morals are absolute standards for behavior, and have this belief that any deviation from the rules will inevitably result in punishment or retribution, maybe from a higher power or their parents. So at about 11 years of age, children recognize that rules may be questioned and or altered, and they consider the feelings, views of others, and believe in equal or equitable justice for all. So they view that obedience to authority is neither necessary nor always desirable, and that violation of these rules are not always wrong, nor are they inevitably punished. And so here we talk about gender identity, and this is where the awareness of one's own gender and the social implications of your own gender. And so what does that really look like? So at around 4 months, infants can match male voices with male faces and female voices with female faces. And they can actually accurately label familiar faces or others like mom, dad, and siblings as boys and girls. So most children can accurately label their own gender by 2.5 to 3 years. Gender constancy develops between 5 to 7 years of age, and prior to that, most 3 to 5 year olds think that they can change their gender when they grow up. So toddlers start to develop gender role stereotypes about the same time they develop an idea of their own gender identity. So they have an idea about what girls and boys like to play with. Girls play with dolls and kitchen items versus boys play with trucks and tools. So remember, this is all being taught and modeled to them by social standards and what is modeled in the home, and having this very rigid type of thinking, almost black and white thinking, no gray. So by the time they get to grade school, they start to draw sharp distinctions between girls and boys in behavior and in psychological characteristics. So they are actually more rigid than adults are. Not so surprising given their rigidity in thinking across the board and in this particular time period. So they first learn the positive characteristics of their own gender, negative characteristics of the opposite gender. This is where we start to hear talk about cooties. So 3 to 7 year olds will often reason and behave like little chauvinists because remember gender stereotypes or rules not to be violated, and remember their cognitive development with no flexibility in thinking. So an example of this could be thinking that girls don't have strong muscles or boys don't have long hair. So these are very rigid type of thinking for boys versus girls. And here we make a switch to really talking about how the family influences socioemotional development. And so when we talk about family dynamics discuss how the family operates as a whole, and no member functions in isolation, as the family is a complex social unit in which individuals are interdependent and reciprocally influence one another. So in other words, what happens to one, especially if it happens to a caregiver, has a detrimental or even a big impact on other members of the family. It doesn't always have to be negative. So for example, here is a negative one. So imagine dad losing his job. Dad becomes withdrawn because he's worried about paying bills and finding another job. He's also irritable because he's stressed and he isn't finding a job quick enough. This impacts mom by her making her work more hours to earn more money or to make ends meet, and is therefore more impatient with children because she's just tired from the end of the day. Sally, the older sibling, has more chores because mom and dad are busy with work and job searching. She's now more hostile with parents because she's an angsty teen and she's tired and she has her own life to live, and she also has to babysit her younger brother to help out with the family. Timmy complains about his sister's aggression. He ends up being more hostile towards her and his parents because they're not paying attention to him. He starts acting out at school and starts earning lower grades because no one's able to help him with his homework. His sister isn't really understanding his homework either. So you can start to see this trickle-down effect. And just to think that this is within a two-parent household where both parents had jobs at one point. And even within this small example, their family functioning is average to high, even at this point. So you can really start to see where negative interactions may start to occur, and they can occur at any level. And again, they have a trickle-down effect through the family. So this leads us to discussing parenting styles, which is more about parenting strategies or behaviors. And I get excited about really early childhood, but parenting and family structure and functioning because this is my area of research, the parent-child relationship. So there are 2 dimensions of parenting in your chapter, which discusses as particularly important because this is based on research. These are parents that have successful or effective parenting strategies include the degree to which parents display warmth, responsiveness to their child's supportiveness, and also acceptance of their children versus parental rejection or non-responsiveness. We also see a discussion on the degrees of parental control and demandedness. So do parents let their child be free to explore, make mistakes, or are they highly controlling, demanding, or even act like helicopter parents where they're always around and always doing things for their children rather than letting them do things on their own? Either extreme is not helpful or wanted for optimal growth for children. And so your text actually talks about Baumrine's parenting styles, or 4 styles of parenting based on these particular dimensions. And so this includes authoritative, which is demanding, but also warm and responsive, sets clear standards and limits. We also see authoritarian, which is cold and unresponsive to children's needs. And what we see is that they have a high need, or they are high in control and demandedness, expect compliance without question or explanation. We also see permissive parents where they responses to the child's needs and wishes, but really don't set any limits or boundaries with their kids. They do not require to regulate themselves or act in appropriate ways. We also see uninvolved or rejecting and neglectful parents, in which they're disengaged, they are low in demandingness, and also low in responsiveness, no limits, no monitoring. They're not supportive, and they're actually focused on their own needs and not their kids. And so you can see where authoritarian, permissive, and uninvolved or neglectful, rejectful parents, how this could really impact children, given all of the things that we've been talking about with socioemotional development, psychological development, cognitive, and even physical motor development. You can really start to see how this may impact children's development overall. So it may be unfair, but actually, interestingly enough, attractive infants and children get more affection and attention from everyone, related or not. And so we see that people are more playful and affectionate with attractive infants. And it's even been shown that mothers or unappealing infants are more likely to talk to other people in their vicinity rather than engage with their own infant. So what we see is that attractive children elicit more positive responses from adults and later in life their own peers. It's not clear why, but parents may be more motivated to invest in a child that shows clear signs of health, and genetic fitness and attractiveness may be an indicator of these things. And so that's more of a type of evolutionary type perspective. So we also see an impact of children's behaviors and temperament on parent behavior. So remember that the parent-child relationship is bidirectional, in which parent behavior influences child behavior and child behavior influences parent behavior. And as such, children who are disobedient, angry, or challenging make it difficult for parents to be authoritative than do children who are compliant and positive. So the degree of the children's negative emotionality, their ability to regulate themselves, their level of obedience, and activity level all impact parental behavior. But also you can take that and spin it on its head and talk about, well, it's also parenting behavior that influences, and parents are the ones that are teaching the children these type of behaviors and supporting or even fostering positive development. So it's a kind of a negative feedback loop, or just you're going round and round in terms of trying to figure out who caused what and who's influencing what. So over time, the bidirectionality of the parent-child interaction reinforces and perpetuates each party's behavior, and it can be either positive or negative. And so, interestingly, when we look at ethnic and cultural influences or differences across cultural groups, authoritarian parenting is not associated with negative outcomes for some cultural groups. So African American girls with authoritarian parents actually perform better than peers on varying measures of academics and socio-emotional assessments. So this is also true for African American boys. And this is also true at all levels of family affluence or income levels. So this trend has been discussed and actually talking about the parents' perception of needing to use this type of parenting style or control in order to protect their children from dangers such as prejudice and discrimination. So in turn, teens actually may recognize that their parents' practices are often due to concern for their own well-being, and they respond positively to their parental demands rather than having negative interactions with them. So we also see that parenting styles can have different meanings in different cultures. So first-generation Chinese American children seem to respond better to authoritarian parenting, as it appears to have few negative effects for these children, at least prior to adolescence. So this may be because children may perceive parental strictness and emphasis on obedience as signs of parental involvement and caring, which is important for family harmony. So, however, when it involves harsh physical punishment, it is often associated with negative effects for children. And so mothers in what we also see within low income families or SES brackets tend to be more controlling, more restrictive, or disapproving in their interactions. But you may come back and ask, well, why is this? Why do we see this type of parenting behavior, and more so in low income families? Not that to say that you wouldn't see it in high income families or even middle income families, but we're just seeing a higher prevalence rate of these behaviors within the low income bracket. When I think of this, I think of more of an understanding of more stressors on the mother to provide for her family. So stress can have a very detrimental impact on the family in more ways than one, for the child and also the parent. So higher SES, what we see within this bracket is that they're often talking with their children more. They elicit more talk from their children, and their children, what we see with this is that it's probably actually due to more of education rather than income level. Because if you're, we'll talk about this more in terms of education, but what we see is that with high income families, they're also naming more objects for kiddos, so they're teaching them more. They follow up more directly on what their children say, and they may foster better communication between the parent and child based on the child's needs, their desires, and the goals. They're more attentive to those. And you can, again, it falls more so on that low-income families it's not that they're not doing this, but their attention and their ability to focus or foster their children's growth has been or may be more directed at survival and making ends meet rather than these more higher order type of needs like their desires and their goals. So what we also see is that highly educated parents hold a more complex view of development than parents with lower education. So highly educated parents are more likely to view their children as active participants in their own development. They tend to be more concerned with their children's thoughts and feelings and encourage that expression. So if we think of this in an evolutionary type of perspective, parents or not even so much an evolutionary perspective, but just thinking about individuals from low education backgrounds are less likely to be informed on development. And so they may not know that. This is another type of explanation. So they may not know what they need in order to foster or to help grow children's development in those areas. And so what we also see, just on a last note, is that within the environment, this is similar to the authoritarian parenting in African American families, but controlling authoritarian parenting style may be adaptive for protecting children from harm in poor neighborhoods where there may be high violence, high substance abuse, and unsafe living conditions. And so these are all contextual variables that you need to think about when you're thinking about family functioning and also parenting and child behavior.